They say the dead don't speak, but I've heard them in the hum of a dormant reactor, in the rain drumming on tin roofs where 75,000 souls once slept without knowing what dawn would bring. Oak Ridge. The name sounds pastoral, doesn't it? Like somewhere your grandmother might have baked pies. But in 1942, it was the place where we learned to split the atom and in doing so, fractured something far more delicate, the illusion that knowledge could ever be innocent again. There are cities that rise from ambition, and then there are cities that materialize from necessity, born in the fevered dream of war. Oak Ridge was the latter. Picture this, a fog-shrouded valley in eastern Tennessee, where the hills fold over themselves like kept secrets, where the very ground seems to exhale silence. The Appalachian mist clings low here, even now, as if it remembers, as if it's trying to hide something still. In the autumn of 1942, the land belonged to farmers, families with names like Brymer and Jones, who'd worked these ridges for generations. Then came the telegrams, terse, official. Your property has been selected for purposes vital to the war effort. 30 days to vacate, no appeals, no exceptions. They left behind cemeteries. Think about that, forced to abandon even their dead. The government relocated some graves, but not all. Somewhere beneath the concrete and the chain-link fences, beneath the laboratories that would soon hum with the frequency of splitting uranium, grandmothers and stillborn children remained, undisturbed witnesses to what we were about to become. By 1943, a city existed where cattle had grazed. Not gradually, almost overnight, like a stage set assembled in darkness. Prefabricated houses arranged in identical rows, their sameness deliberate, designed to discourage attachment. 60,000 workers arrived first, then 70, then 75,000, their faces blurred in the black and white photographs that survive, anonymous soldiers in an invisible war. They came by train, by bus, by battered Ford trucks that coughed exhaust into the mountain air. They came because their country called. They came because jobs were scarce and war made patriots of us all. But they didn't know what they were building. That was the peculiar genius of it, the particular cruelty. Compartmentalization, they called it. You turned the dial on your instrument. You monitored the temperature in your sector. You enriched something. What? Doesn't matter, not your concern. Just do your job, collect your paycheck, and for God's sake, don't ask questions. Dr. Elias Thorne arrived on a November evening when the rain fell sideways, cold and insistent. The telegram that summoned him had been cryptic. Your expertise required for work of national importance. Report to Knoxville Station, 600 hours. Bring nothing you cannot carry. Tell no one where you're going. He was a theoretical physicist from Berkeley, 34 years old, with chalk dust permanently embedded beneath his fingernails and a mind that spoke fluently in the language of mathematics. His wife Clara sat beside him on the train, her hands folded over a suitcase that contained everything they'd been allowed to bring. 3 dresses, 2 suits, a photograph of her mother, their wedding album. "What have we stepped into?" she whispered as the locomotive's whistle cut through the rain, a sound like something dying. Elias had no answer. The truth was, he didn't know, not entirely. They'd told him about uranium, about isotopes, about the theoretical possibility of sustained chain reaction, but theory and application were different countries, separated by a border of consequences he was only beginning to perceive. The facility itself defied easy description. It sprawled across 59,000 acres, nearly 90 square miles of restricted zone, ringed with guard towers and checkpoints where armed soldiers examined badges under harsh floodlights. The main complex housed machines unlike anything the world had seen. Calutrons, massive electromagnetic devices that separated uranium isotopes atom by atom, their circular tracks humming with a frequency that made your teeth ache. Some workers said they could feel it in their bones at night, a vibration just below consciousness, like the earth itself was purring with contained energy. Elias worked in Y12, where the calutrons lived. On his 3rd day, standing before the control panel as the machine cycled up to operating temperature, he felt it, a sensation he couldn't name. These particles, invisible and impossibly small, were responding to forces he commanded. He was conducting an orchestra of matter itself, and the music was both beautiful and terrible. "These particles," he murmured to Jennings, the engineer who'd been assigned to orient him. "They're alive, in a sense, whispering equations in the dark." Jennings laughed, but it was an uneasy sound. "Don't let that kind of talk get around, Doc. People already th. Inc. You physics types are half crazy." But Elias wasn't being poetic. He meant it literally. When you worked with radioactive material, you developed an awareness, a sixth sense for its presence. The Geiger counters crackled their warnings, but you learned to feel it before the instruments registered anything. A prickling on your skin, a metallic taste on your tongue, a whisper in the peripheral awareness that something was there, invisible and hungry. The city grew around them like an organism responding to stimulus. Cafeterias appeared, a library, even a symphony orchestra, because someone in Washington decided that workers needed culture, needed normalcy, needed the pretense that this was just another American town. But normalcy was a costume that fit poorly here. You couldn't have normal conversations when every other sentence might be classified. You couldn't form real friendships when everyone was hiding something, even if they didn't know what. At night, lying beside Clara in their prefabricated bedroom, where the walls were so thin they could hear the couple next door breathing, Elias listened to the wind moving through the valley. And sometimes, he would never have admitted this to anyone, he thought he heard voices in it. Not words exactly, more like echoes. The murmur of questions being asked in rooms he'd never entered, by people he'd never met, about decisions that would ripple outward through time in ways none of them could fully imagine. The shadows were lengthening, even then, even before we knew what we'd created. The ghosts were gathering at the threshold, waiting for us to open the door we were so carefully, so methodically designing. And when we finally turned that key, when we finally unleashed what we'd built in the secret city carved from Tennessee clay, well, the world would never stop hearing those whispers again. The footprints in Tennessee clay never quite wash away, do they? They sink deeper with each rain, becoming part of the Earth's memory. And Oak Ridge, that impossible city, was built on such footprints, on foundations that trembled with the weight of what we were attempting. It began with a letter, August 1939, Einstein's hand shaking as he signed his name to a warning that would birth an atomic age. Leo Szilard drafted the words, but Einstein's signature carried the gravity. Germany might be building a weapon from split atoms, a bomb that could level cities. Roosevelt read it twice. By 1942, the Manhattan Engineer District was born, a name deliberately mundane, designed to bore anyone who might be listening. $2 billion. Think about that sum in 1942 money, enough to build a fleet of battleships. Instead, we built laboratories in the wilderness. The Tennessee Valley became a construction site that never slept. Trucks arrived in convoys, headlights cutting through pre-dawn darkness, carrying I-beams and concrete mixers and men who'd been told only that the work mattered. The ground fought back, red mud that swallowed boots whole, that clung to everything like it was trying to hold onto the world it knew before. The smell was distinctive. Wet pine, diesel exhaust, and underneath it all, something electric, anticipatory, like the air before a thunderstorm that never quite breaks. Margaret Harlan, pegged to everyone who knew her, was 22 when she stepped off the bus at Oak Ridge, a high school diploma in her pocket and a letter promising good wages for technical work. She'd grown up in Knoxville, daughter of a grocer, and the advertisement in the newspaper had been vague enough to be intriguing. What they didn't tell her was that she'd be operating equipment worth more than her family's entire block, machinery so sensitive that a tremor in her hand could compromise a day's work. The calutron, even the name sounded otherworldly. Rows of them filled the Y12 plant like altars in some vast industrial cathedral. Each one used electromagnetic fields to separate uranium isotopes, U-235 from U-238, atom by painstaking atom. Peg learned to read the dials by their glow, to adjust the magnetic coils when the readings drifted. Her supervisor, a brusque woman named Mrs. Keller, never explained what they were separating or why. "Keep your numbers steady," she'd say, "that's all that matters." But in the dormitory at night, when Peg lay in her narrow bed listening to Helen breathe in the cot beside her, she couldn't stop wondering. The machines had a voice, a low, persistent hum that seemed to seep through the walls, through her skin, into her dreams. One evening, she broke the unspoken rule. "They say we're making something to end the war," she whispered into the darkness. "But at night, I hear the machines whispering back, secrets too heavy for daylight." Helen was silent for a long moment. Then, "Best not to think about it, Peg." But how could you not think about it? Oak Ridge swelled to 75,000 people by 1945, a population larger than Knoxville itself, yet it appeared on no map. 1,000 buses ferried workers each day through checkpoints where guards examined badges with the scrutiny of border agents. The city had its own newspaper, carefully censored. Its own shops, where you could buy everything except information. Even a symphony orchestra, because someone in Washington decided that culture would make the secrecy more bearable. Dr. Elias Thorne attended one of those concerts Brahms performed in a hastily constructed auditorium that still smelled of sawdust. He sat in the back row, watching the musicians' bows move in unison, and thought about particles behaving in patterns we'd only recently learned to predict. Clara squeezed his hand during the second movement. "It's beautiful," she murmured. He nodded, though he was thinking about something else entirely. The moral fog that had settled over his work like the valley mist that never quite burned away. We chased the atom's fire, he wrote in his journal that night, blind to the shadows it cast on our dreams. The scale of it all defied comprehension. 3 major facilities sprawling across 59,000 acres. K25, where gaseous diffusion separated isotopes through thousands of barriers. X10, the first successful reactor, its graphite core containing a controlled chain reaction that would have seemed like witchcraft a decade earlier. And Y12, Peg's domain, where electromagnetic separation did its slow, precise work. The FBI had agents embedded everywhere, though nobody talked about it openly. You learned to recognize them, the men in suits who lingered too long at cafeteria tables, who asked casual questions that weren't casual at all. A worker named Jim Patterson was escorted off-site one afternoon for mentioning the word uranium to his wife during a monitored phone call. He never came back. The message was clear. Silence was patriotic. Houston's were treason. On Sundays, some locals who'd been displaced still gathered near the Clinch River, in the narrow strips of land not yet consumed by the project. They brought picnic baskets and old photographs, pointing out where their houses used to stand, where their grandparents were buried. Their children splashed in the shallows while the parents sang hymns that drifted across the water, mingling with the industrial drone from the plants. 2 worlds, occupying the same space but speaking different languages. Peg kept a photograph hidden in her locker, a community dance from before, when Oak Ridge was just farmland and possibility meant something simpler. In the photo, her mother smiled at the camera, alive and young and unburdened by knowledge of atomic weapons. Sometimes Peg would look at it between shifts, trying to remember what innocence felt like. The radiation warnings came later, after Hiroshima, after we understood what we'd actually been building. But even then, in 1943 and 44, there was an awareness, a prickling sensation that something dangerous was being contained, barely. Workers joked nervously about glowing in the dark. The Geiger counters clicked their staccato warnings, and we learned to live with the sound. The shadows were lengthening. Beneath the orchestrated normalcy, beneath the carefully maintained illusion of just another wartime factory town, something else was stirring. Personal hauntings, private reckonings, voices rising like mist from the Clinch River asking us to listen, really listen, to the lives being woven into this atomic tapestry and to the ghosts that would follow when the weaving was done. Those voices rising from the Clinch River found their way into homes, into dreams, into the midnight hours when sleep refused to come, and the only companion was the fluorescent hum of laboratory lights that never quite turned off. This is where the human cost reveals itself, not in statistics or budget reports, but in the fractured souls of those who touched the atom and found it touching back. Elias Thorne took to wandering the Y12 facility after hours, when the day shift had clocked out and only the skeleton crew remained. The hallways stretched longer at night, shadows dancing on whitewashed walls like specters performing some ritual he couldn't quite decipher. He'd stand before the control panels, watching needles fluctuate, and smoke cigarette after cigarette, until the acrid smell mixed with the chemical tang of uranium compounds and became indistinguishable from his own breath. There was a clock in the corridor, an ordinary institutional timepiece, the kind you'd find in any government building, but Elias had come to hate it. Each tick felt like an accusation. Time was running out, or perhaps time was the problem itself, the way it kept moving forward, carrying them inexorably toward a conclusion none of them could quite envision, but all of them sensed lurking just beyond the next calculation, the next test, the next breakthrough. By 1944, the K25 gaseous diffusion plant had become the largest building under one roof anywhere on Earth. Think about that. A structure so massive it created its own weather patterns inside, where morning fog would gather near the ceiling and rain down on workers like some industrial baptism. Yet the people who labored there, thousands of them, lived in a silence that was almost religious. You didn't discuss your work at dinner. You didn't mention it to your spouse. You barely acknowledged it to yourself. Clara Thorne felt the isolation like a physical thing, a presence that occupied their prefabricated house more substantially than the furniture. She'd wake at 3 in the morning, Elias' side of the bed empty again, and lie there listening to the wind move through the valley. It had a voice, that wind, a particular quality she couldn't ignore. One evening, when Elias finally returned home as dawn was breaking, she was sitting at the kitchen table with cold coffee and trembling hands. "Elias," she said, not looking at him, "the wind outside, it sounds like children crying, or is it the reactors mourning what we've unleashed?" He stood in the doorway, still wearing his lab coat, chalk dust on his sleeves. The question hung between them like something alive. "It's just echoes, love," he said finally, his voice hollowed out by exhaustion. Forgotten whispers from the void were splitting open. But even as he said it, he wondered if he believed it, because he'd heard those sounds too, in the hum of the calutrons, in the rush of coolant through reactor cores. In the Geiger counter's staccato clicks that measured invisible danger, there was a music to it, yes, but also something else, a lament perhaps for the innocence they were methodically dismantling, one atom at a time. Dr. Lena Voss understood something about monsters. She'd fled Berlin in 1938, watching her homeland transform into a nightmare of torchlit parades and broken glass. Now, in Tennessee, she found herself working on equations that could birth a different kind of darkness. The irony wasn't lost on her. Some nights, alone in her tiny apartment, she'd spread her fission diagrams across the floor and stare at them until the numbers blurred into something almost hieroglyphic, ancient warnings written in the language of physics. "We flee one monster," she whispered to the empty room, only to birth another. Lena had known Lise Meitner, had corresponded with her before the war made such communications impossible. She remembered Meitner's excitement about nuclear fission, the pure scientific wonder of discovering how uranium nuclei could split. But wonder, Lena had learned, was morally neutral. It could illuminate or incinerate. The choice was human, not atomic. She kept a photograph hidden beneath her mattress, her brother's family still in Germany, their fate unknown. Every calculation she completed was both an act of survival and a kind of betrayal. If the bomb worked, it might end the war, might save lives. But whose lives, and at what cost to the souls of those who built it? The isolation gnawed at all of them differently. Some workers drank themselves numb in the recreation halls, dancing to big band music piped through tinny speakers while trying to forget that they couldn't talk about why they were all here. Others retreated into themselves, becoming ghosts long before death claimed them. The prefab houses all looked identical, deliberate architectural amnesia, so you could walk home and end up at a stranger's door, realize your mistake, and feel a moment of vertigo wondering if you'd ever actually had a home. Elias started writing letters he never sent. "Dear God, dear future, dear whoever finds this." The salutations varied, but the content was consistent. "I am complicit in something I cannot fully see. We are all complicit. The atoms don't judge us, they simply obey the laws we've uncovered. But those laws there's the melancholy of progress, isn't it? How it cloaks ambition in nostalgia's veil, leaving souls adrift between what was and what must be." He hid the letters in a locked drawer in his office, alongside classified reports he wasn't supposed to remove from the facility. The rules had become suggestions. Everything had become suggestions, except the deadline, which remained absolute. Margaret Harlan noticed the change in the scientists she occasionally glimpsed in the cafeteria. They'd aged years in months, their eyes carrying a weight that had nothing to do with sleeplessness. Once, Dr. Voss sat down across from her by accident, lost in thought, and Peg watched as the woman stared at her coffee cup like it contained answers to questions no one was asking aloud. "Are we doing the right thing?" Peg ventured, breaking protocol, breaking silence. Dr. Voss looked up, startled, as if seeing Peg for the first time. Her eyes were wet. "I don't know," she said. "I don't think anyone knows. We only know we cannot stop." And that was the terrible truth, wasn't it? They'd set something in motion, not just the uranium in the calutrons, but history itself, cause and effect cascading forward with the inevitability of physics. The whispers from the Clinch River grew louder, or perhaps they'd been listening more carefully. Either way, something was shifting. The shadows held secrets that were beginning to stir, to unfurl like classified files slipping from trembling hands, whispering of dreads yet to come. Those classified files, once opened, revealed more than data. They revealed a realm where the boundaries between empirical science and something older, something unknowable, began to dissolve like fog under an atomic sun. The veils were thinning, and what lay beneath was neither purely physical nor entirely imagined. It existed in that uncertain space where human perception meets radiation's invisible dance. The first reports came from night shift workers at the X-10 reactor. Blue light, ethereal, pulsing, appearing in the coolant tanks when the reactor was running hot. Scientists explained it away quickly. Cherenkov radiation, they said, a known phenomenon when charged particles exceed the speed of light in water. Perfectly natural, perfectly explicable. But explanation didn't stop the whispers. Ghost lights, the workers called them. Omens. Some refused to work certain shifts, claimed the blue glow followed them home, lingered at the edges of their vision when they closed their eyes. Management dismissed it as superstition, wartime anxiety manifesting in optical illusions, yet the reports kept coming. A technician swore he saw faces in the glow. A janitor quit after watching the light pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat. The health effects were harder to dismiss. By 1944, declassified Atomic Energy Commission memos would later reveal early radiation exposures were causing mysterious ailments among workers: nausea, hair loss, lesions that wouldn't heal. The doctors documented symptoms but offered vague diagnoses: industrial fatigue, they wrote, or nervous exhaustion. Nobody used the word radiation poisoning because officially the levels were safe. The instruments said so. The calculations confirmed it. But bodies don't lie the way instruments can be calibrated to lie. Elias Thorne started walking the perimeter at night. The fence line ran for miles through woods that had watched this valley long before uranium became anything more than a curiosity in a periodic table. The fog gathered thick here, rolling up from the Clinch River to blanket the forest floor in layers of white that smelled of damp leaves and something else, something metallic, sharp, like blood or fear or both. He told himself he was clearing his head, getting fresh air. The truth was messier. He was looking for something, or maybe running from something. The distinction had blurred. It was on one of these walks, 3 in the morning on a moonless October night, that he saw it. A figure standing between the pines. Human-shaped but wrong somehow, its edges too soft, bleeding into the fog like watercolor on wet paper. Elias stopped, his breath caught. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, but somehow he heard it anyway. A voice that might have been his own thoughts or might have been something older, whispered in a tone of infinite sorrow, "What you've wrought will echo through eternity." He blinked, the figure was gone. Only fog remained, curling around tree trunks, indifferent to his racing pulse. Guilt, he told himself, walking faster now, back toward the lights of the facility. Just guilt taking shape in exhausted hallucinations. We're all cracking under the pressure. Nothing supernatural about that. But his hands shook for hours afterward, and the metallic taste in his mouth, fear's aftertaste, wouldn't wash away no matter how much coffee he drank. Dr. Lena Voss had her own visitations, though hers came in waking dreams, equations that wrote themselves in her mind during the thin hours before dawn. She'd see the fission process not as physics but as violation, a tearing of something fundamental, something sacred. The atom wasn't just matter, it was a door, and they'd kicked it open without asking what might be on the other side. She confided in Elias one evening in the mostly empty cafeteria. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Somewhere a radio played Glenn Miller, but the music sounded wrong, distorted, like it was traveling through water. "In splitting the atom," she said, stirring cold soup she had no intention of eating, "we've torn the veil between worlds. Now the shadows whisper back our sins." Elias wanted to tell her she was being dramatic, poetic maybe, but unscientific, yet he couldn't, not after what he'd seen in the woods. "What do you hear?" he asked instead, "in the whispers?" Lena looked up, her eyes were dark hollows. "Names, the names of everyone who will die because of what we've made. A litany, an endless roll call that hasn't happened yet but already exists in the space between particles, waiting to become real." The dew gathered on the metal fences each morning, turning them into monuments to something no one could name. Workers would touch the cold wet metal and feel it, a transmission of dread through fingertips, through skin, into marrow. The wind howled through the valley like distant sirens warning of fallout that hadn't fallen yet, but inevitably would. Margaret Harlan stopped sleeping well, her dreams were blue-lit underwater affairs where she operated calutrons that separated not uranium but souls, sorting them into 2 categories, saved and damned. She'd wake gasping, sheets soaked with sweat that smelled faintly of ozone. There was nostalgia in the dread, strange as that sounds, a longing for the world before they'd understood fission, before Einstein's letter, before the choice had even presented itself. Some workers kept photographs from that lost time, county fairs, Sunday picnics, children playing in fields that were now restricted zones. They'd look at these images like archaeologists studying artifacts from a vanished civilization. We were there once, we were innocent. The photographs seemed to say, remember when matter was solid, remember when atoms were just theory. But innocence once split doesn't recombine. There's no reverse reaction for knowledge. The phenomena intensified, more reports of ghost lights. A security guard claimed he'd seen a woman in old-fashioned dress walking through a locked laboratory, passing through walls like they were air. When he checked the building's history, he learned it stood where a cemetery had been raised. A technician working late swore he heard children singing, though no children were allowed in the facility after dark, or ever. The rational explanations grew thinner, more desperate. Mass hysteria, carbon monoxide from the reactors, sleep deprivation. Anything but the possibility that they'd opened something that refused to close, that the atom had secrets beyond physics, that splitting matter might fracture reality itself in ways no equation predicted. And yet, the work continued, the enrichment proceeded, the deadline approached. They were committed now, bound to this trajectory like particles in an accelerator, racing toward collision whether they wanted to or not. The veils thinned further, the shadows grew longer, and as autumn deepened into winter, as 1944 bled toward 1945, a crescendo of dread gathered, echoes amplifying into a storm of nostalgia and terror, demanding confrontation with the project's darkest legacy. The storm broke in summer, not with rain but with fire, fire that bloomed half a world away, a mushroom cloud rising over Hiroshima like some terrible flower announcing the death of one age and the birth of another. August 6, 1945. The date seared itself into memory, into history, into the collective soul of everyone who'd touched the project, even those who never knew what they were building until the radio broadcasts crackled through the static and told them what their hands had wrought. The Tennessee heat that summer was oppressive, biblical, the kind that made asphalt soft and thoughts slower, that pressed down on Oak Ridge like a physical weight, sweat mixed with the ozone scent of electrical storms that threatened but never quite arrived. The air tasted metallic, everything tasted metallic, the water, the food, the fear that had settled into their throats and wouldn't swallow down. The news came in fragments, censored, sanitized. A new weapon of unprecedented power has been deployed against Japan. The war may soon end. But the scientists knew. They understood what those careful words meant. They'd done the calculations. They knew the yield, the blast radius, the temperatures hot enough to vaporize stone. 70,000 souls, gone in an instant, in the time it takes to blink. Later, the number would climb higher as radiation sickness claimed thousands more. But in those first hours, that first day, 70,000 was the number that circulated through Oak Ridge in whispers, in horrified glances exchanged in hallways, in the trembling hands of people who suddenly understood the weight they'd been carrying. Elias Thorne climbed to the ridge that evening, the highest point overlooking the facility, where you could see the entire sprawl of it, the separation plants, the reactors, the dormitories arranged in their soulless rows. The wind up here was fierce, howling through the pines like something alive, like voices carried across the Pacific on currents of guilt and grief. He stood there as the sun set, turning the sky the color of blood and copper, and he listened. The dead were screaming. Not literally, he wasn't mad, not quite, but he could feel them. 70,000 voices compressed into a single cry that echoed through the space between atoms, between heartbeats, between what was and what could never be again. Clara found him there as darkness fell. She'd known where he'd go, she always knew. Elias, she said softly, standing beside him but not touching, as if he'd become something too charged, too dangerous for casual contact. We thought we were gods, he said, voice hollow, eyes fixed on the lights below that had begun to blink on like stars in an inverted sky, splitting the indivisible, commanding the fundamental forces of creation. But listen, he turned to her and she saw that he'd been crying, that his face was wet with something more than sweat. The shadows are screaming back, Clara, echoing our hubris in every fallout cloud, in every particle we set loose. We didn't create, we desecrated. She had no answer. What answer could there be? In the Y-12 plant, Margaret Harlan operated the calutrons one final time. The war was ending. Production would wind down. Soon these machines would be shut down, mothballed relics of a desperate time. Her hands trembled on the controls. They'd been steady for 3 years, but now they shook like leaves in a storm she couldn't see coming. The dials glowed their familiar green. The hum was the same as always, but everything had changed. Each adjustment she made, each fractional correction to the magnetic field felt different now that she knew where it led, what it became. Ah, the melancholy irony of it. Victory tasted of ash. They'd celebrated in the streets. She'd seen the newsreels, people dancing in Times Square, kissing strangers, throwing confetti like the world had been reborn. And maybe it had, but into what? She thought about the photograph in her locker. Her mother's smile, frozen in time before any of this began. That woman existed in a different universe now, one where atoms stayed whole, where the worst weapons were bullets and bombs you could see coming. There was nostalgia in the knowing, a longing for pre-atomic innocence that felt impossibly distant, though only 3 years had passed. 3 years, an eternity, a blink. Dr. Lena Voss hadn't slept since the news broke. She'd retreated to her office, surrounded by papers that now read like prophecy, fallout projections, wind pattern analyses, radiation dispersal models. The numbers were elegant in their horror, beautiful equations describing death on scales previously confined to plague and natural disaster. This inferno we've ignited, she murmured to the empty room, to the ghosts that seemed to crowd the corners now, pressing in close. It whispers of winters without end. Nuclear winter. The concept was theoretical still, wouldn't have a name for decades, but she could see it in the mat. Hematics, the potential for enough bombs to blot out the sun, to turn the earth into a frozen tomb. They'd opened that door, proved it could be done. Now who would close it? Could it even be closed? Her hands moved across the papers, ink staining her fingers as she wrote calculations that no one had requested, that served no purpose except to map the dimensions of the abyss they'd created. Sometimes her pen would pause mid-equation and she'd hear it, the whisper of atoms splitting, the quiet hiss of particles decaying, the voice of matter itself crying out against what had been done to it. Was she going mad? Possibly, probably, but madness seemed appropriate. Sanity was what had brought them here. The facility hummed through the night, a lower key now winding down. Workers moved through corridors with the shuffle of the defeated, victory hollow in their mouths. They'd saved the world. They'd damned it. Both things were true simultaneously, existing in superposition like quantum states that would never collapse into comfortable certainty. Shadows lengthened as August turned to September, stretching across the valley until Oak Ridge seemed to exist in permanent twilight. The blue glow from the reactors continued, Cherenkov radiation still dancing its eerie ballet, but the ghost lights felt different now. Less like omens, more like memories. The dead of Hiroshima, the dead of Nagasaki, for the second bomb had fallen too, plutonium this time, a different path to the same Inferno. Their voices joined the chorus that had always haunted this place. The wind carried them. The rain that finally came washed them into the soil. They became part of Oak Ridge the way radiation becomes part of bone, settling in, permanent, irretrievable. And even as the Inferno's echoes faded into history, into the careful archives of the Atomic Energy Commission and the quiet nightmares of those who'd lived through it, a haunting resolution beckoned, like whispers settling into the earth, urging us to reckon with the ghosts that linger in Oak Ridge's forgotten corners, demanding we remember what we'd rather forget. The whispers settled into the earth, but they didn't fade. They changed form, transformed from urgent warnings into something quieter, more insidious, the kind of regret that lives in blueprints yellowing in forgotten drawers, in medical records stamped with classifications that wouldn't lift for decades, in the trembling hands of aging scientists who carried secrets heavier than uranium to their graves. Oak Ridge didn't disappear when the war ended. It evolved. In 1947, the Atomic Energy Commission assumed control, bureaucratizing what had been born in wartime urgency. The fence lines remained. The guard towers still watched. But the mission shifted from desperate creation to careful management, from racing toward apocalypse to learning to live with what we'd unleashed. Declassification came slowly, grudgingly, beginning in the 1950s. Documents emerged in fragments, censored, redacted, pages blacked out like night had fallen on certain truths. What they revealed, when they revealed anything at all, was a litany of consequences nobody had calculated during those fevered years of construction and enrichment. Over 200 workers filed lawsuits, their bodies betraying them decades after they'd turned their final dial, monitored their last reading. The medical terms were clinical, almost gentle. Body burdens, the doctors wrote, as if plutonium in bone marrow was something you could carry and set down at day's end. Radiation doesn't work that way. It accumulates, it persists. It whispers to your cells in a language older than words, telling them to forget how to divide properly, how to remain human. The autumn winds of the 1960s carried different sounds through Oak Ridge. The creak of rusting gates, opening and closing on hinges that had seen too much use and now saw too little. Buildings stood empty, their windows dark, their purposes obsolete or relocated or simply forgotten. In the archives, film reels decayed in climate-controlled vaults, emitting a faint, acrid smell. Vinegar syndrome, they called it, the acetate breaking down, memories dissolving at the molecular level. The reactor hum had changed too, subdued now. Some facilities shut down entirely, their cooling systems silent for the first time in 20 years. Walking through those halls, and some still did, maintenance workers and historians and the occasional aging scientist on pilgrimage, your footsteps echoed differently. The acoustics of abandonment sound hollow in ways occupied spaces never do. Elias Thorne returned in 1966. 71 years old, body failing him the way bodies do when they've absorbed too many rads, too much stress, too much knowledge that wasn't meant for human minds. They gave him a visitor's badge and a guide, some young technician who hadn't been born when the project began, who knew Oak Ridge only as history, not as lived terror. He touched the walls in the old Y-12 building. The paint was different, fresh coats covering the originals, but beneath his palm he swore he could feel it. The hum, the presence, the ghosts of particles that had danced here under his command, obedient to forces he'd learned to wield but never truly understood. We built wonders from whispers, he said, not to the technician but to the empty air, to an audience of memory and regret, But the shadows we cast, they outlive us all. The technician didn't know what to say to that. How could he? You had to have been there, you had to have split the atom and felt it split you back. Clara had died in 1963. Heart failure, the death certificate said, but Elias knew better. She'd died of accumulated grief, of 3 decades living with a man who was only partially present, the rest of him forever locked in that first moment of revelation when they understood what their work had become. In her final months, when the morphine made her honest, she'd spoken about the wind, about the voices she'd heard in their Tennessee nights. "Oh, how nostalgia warps the pain," she'd whispered once, holding his hand with fingers gone thin as paper. "Turning dread into a bittersweet lullaby, we remember the camaraderie, the purpose, but the cost. Elias, the cost sings a different tune, doesn't it?" He'd had no answer then, he had none now. Margaret Harlan, Peg, always Peg, became a keeper of oral histories in her later years. Grandmother to 5, living in Knoxville, she'd tell her story to anyone who asked, and many did as the anniversaries accumulated. 20 years since Hiroshima, 30, 40. Her hands still trembled sometimes, phantom dial turning, muscle memory of motions that had enriched death. "The machine stopped," she told an interviewer in 1975, her voice steady but her eyes distant, seeing something beyond the camera. "But the whispers didn't. They echo in my dreams, tales of what we wrought in secrecy. Sometimes I wake up and I swear I can hear them humming, that old calutron frequency, like it's still running somewhere in my bones." The interviewer had nodded. Sympathetically, not understanding. How could anyone understand unless they'd been there, unless they'd operated equipment whose purpose was kept from them until the purpose became mushroom clouds on newsreels? Dr. Lena Voss took a different path. She never gave interviews, never attended reunions or memorial services, but she wrote letters, anonymous, untraceable, to newspapers, to senators, to anyone who might listen. Letters about ethical reckonings, about the responsibilities of scientists who unleash forces they cannot contain. Letters that asked uncomfortable questions about accountability and legacy and whether progress was worth the souls it consumed. She signed them only a witness. The authorities knew who wrote them. They chose not to interfere. By the 1970s, the stories were coming out anyway. The lawsuits, the health studies, the slowly mounting evidence that Oak Ridge had left scars deeper than anyone had admitted during those optimistic post-war years when atomic energy promised a future too bright to look at directly. Some nights in the moments between sleep and waking, all of them, the survivors, the workers, the scientists scattered across continents, heard it. The hum, the whisper, the voice of split atoms calling across the years, reminding them that matter remembers what was done to it, that energy never truly disappears, it only changes form. The blueprints faded in their filing cabinets, ink turning sepia, paper brittling at the edges. Technical specifications became archaeological artifacts, records of a time when humans learned to play with fire hot enough to ignite the sun. But the regret didn't fade. It crystallized, hardened into something permanent, a monument more lasting than any bronze plaque or memorial statue. And in this fading, in this slow dissolution of urgency into history, a final haunting emerged, whispers coalescing into a timeless elegy for the souls forever tethered to the secret city's atomic heart, for the living and the dead, bound together by what they'd built and what it had built in them. The elegy becomes eternal because some stories refuse to end. They linger in the spaces between breath and remembrance, woven into soil and steel, and the very air that moves through the Tennessee Valley, where 75,000 souls once labored in service of a secret that would reshape existence itself. Oak Ridge endures. That's the peculiar grace of it, or perhaps the curse. The city didn't vanish when its wartime purpose concluded. It adapted, transformed, became something else while remaining forever what it was. The Oak Ridge National Laboratory, designated as such in 1943, though few knew it then, continues its work today, advancing peaceful applications of nuclear technology, researching isotopes for medical treatments, studying materials science at scales both cosmic and quantum. But walk through its museums and you'll find the artifacts of another time. Badges stamped, restricted, in stern capital letters. Photographs of workers whose faces blur into anonymity, their names lost or classified or simply forgotten. Oral histories preserved in audio archives, voices crackling through decades of magnetic decay, telling stories of ghost towns within the city, neighborhoods that existed and then didn't, buildings erected and demolished in the span of months, leaving only foundations and the memories of those who'd lived there briefly, intensely, before being reassigned to another temporary existence. The soil remembers too. Radiation doesn't respect time the way humans do. Isotopes with half-lives measured in millennia remain embedded in the ground where they spilled or leaked, or were deliberately buried when we didn't know better, when we thought Earth could absorb anything. Test bore samples still show elevated readings in certain zones, carefully marked and monitored, whispers of 1940s haste preserved in atomic notation. Modern visitors walk paths where Elias Thorne once paced in the small hours, where Margaret Harlan caught buses at dawn, where Lena Voss stood smoking cigarettes and watching the calutrons glow through laboratory windows. Do they feel it, the presence, the weight of history compressed into present moment? Some claim they do. A tour guide at the American Museum of Science and Energy, formerly the Oak Ridge Museum, tells of visitors who pause in certain rooms, who swear they hear humming that isn't there, who see figures in peripheral vision that vanish when confronted directly. Ghosts, perhaps, or echoes. Or the human need to believe that extraordinary events leave permanent impressions, that tragedy and triumph both inscribe themselves on the fabric of place in ways that transcend mere memory. One visitor, a physicist from California visiting in 2019, stood before an exhibit of original calutron components and felt, she struggled to describe it later, a presence, an awareness, as if someone was standing beside her wanting to speak. She turned, found herself alone, but the sensation persisted, and then, barely audible beneath the museum's air-conditioning hum, she heard it, or thought she heard it, or needed to hear it. Listen to the shadows, they hold the truths we buried. The voice sounded like static, like wind through empty buildings, like her own subconscious trying to process the magnitude of what had occurred here. But she wrote it down in her journal that evening. Listen to the shadows, because some truths refuse to stay buried, no matter how much concrete we pour, how many years elapse, how carefully we curate the official narrative. The legacies intertwine. Peg Harlan's interviews, preserved in the Voices of the Manhattan Project Oral History Archive, speak in her Tennessee drawl about dials and duty and the dreams that never left her. Lena Voss's anonymous letters, eventually identified and collected posthumously, articulate a moral reckoning that continues to resonate in ethical debates about scientific responsibility. Their voices overlap in the historical record, creating a dialogue across time. We chase the atom's light, Peg's recorded voice says, pausing as she searches for words, but found only echoes of our humanity, the bright parts and the dark parts, all of it. Lena's letters echo the sentiment in more philosophical terms. In seeking to master nature's deepest secrets, we discovered our own, our capacity for brilliance and our equal capacity for horror. The atom showed us ourselves, and we have yet to recover from that revelation. And isn't it wondrous? Forgive me, I hesitate here because the word seems inadequate. It wondrous, this melancholy dance of progress and loss. How forgotten whispers become the wind that shapes tomorrow. How the shadows cast by those who split atoms in Tennessee valleys now stretch across continents, across generations, defining the very shape of our contemporary anxieties and aspirations. The modern reactors hum their subdued requiem. Different technology than what Elias and his colleagues pioneered, safer by orders of magnitude monitored by systems they couldn't have imagined. But the fundamental principle remains unchanged. Matter and energy, interconvertible, subject to laws that were ancient when Earth was young and will persist long after humanity's last word is spoken. Leaves rustle over buried pipelines. Autumn comes to Oak Ridge the way it always has, painting the hills in colors of fire and rust, the same hills that once hid the world's most dangerous secret. Children play in parks built over former test sites, their laughter carrying on the same wind that once carried the concerns of scientists grappling with godlike power and all-too-human frailty. The fences remain, though the security has softened. You can drive through Oak Ridge now without military checkpoints, can photograph the historical markers that explain what occurred here without fear of arrest. The secrets have mostly been declassified. The truth, such as it is, has been released into the wild. But the ghosts remain, tethered not by unfinished business, that peculiar fiction of popular hauntings, but by the simple fact that some places absorb their history so completely that past and present exist in constant conversation. Oak Ridge is one such place. You can feel it if you're paying attention, if you listen. The whispers are eternal because they're not really whispers at all. They're questions we still haven't answered. What price progress? What cost security? When does knowledge become burden? When does burden become legacy? When does legacy become warning? Elias Thorne died in 1974, Margaret Harlan in 1998, Lena Voss in 1981, Clara 1963. All the actors in this atomic drama have taken their final bows, have been gathered into history's embrace, but their shadows linger, in the soil, in the archives, in the physics that governs every nuclear reactor, every medical isotope, every warhead still waiting in silos scattered across continents. The secret city keeps its secrets still, not the technical specifications, those are mostly public now, but the deeper truths about what it means to touch forces fundamental to existence, to split what nature fused, to become, for a moment, co-authors of creation or destruction, the line between them sometimes too thin to see. Listen, can you hear them? The whispers in the Tennessee wind, the echoes in empty reactor halls, the voices preserved in archives and embedded in atoms themselves. They're still speaking, still asking us to remember, still wondering if we learned anything from what they wrought in those desperate years when the world hung in balance and they held the fulcrum. The shadows know, they've always known, and they're eternal, these whispers, patient as isotopes, persistent as half-lives, waiting for us to listen.